Most of us know the context of what happens in John chapter 2. We understand and we know what the Bible teaches us in John chapter 2, beginning there, the first part of the chapter where Jesus turns the water into wine at the wedding of Cana of Galilee, and we see him performing his first miracle. We see him going on into Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple, and he cleanses the temple, and he says, he runs the money changers out, and he said, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves, and he runs the money changers out. We see Jesus come on into John chapter 3, where we see him having the interview with Nicodemus and how he said, you must be born again, and how he works there in that situation. But there are some verses at the very end of John chapter 2 that most people don't even know are there. Some what I call parenthetical verses just that are stuck in to let us see what is going on behind the scenes with the people and with Jesus. The Bible says in John 2, verse 23, says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. The Bible teaches us that behind the scenes of Jesus working, that there were people that were coming to him wanting to know him, but yet at the same time there was something else that was going on in the life of Jesus as he was rejecting these people. You see, these people here, there are three things about them I want to point out to you today and share with you a little bit about my life. First thing, that these people had received the teachings of Jesus. It says that they committed themselves to him. It says that they believed in his name. They believed in him. The modern translation said they trusted in him. They believed in him. They had seen what he had done. They believed that he was the Son of God. They believed that his miracles were real. They believed he was born of a virgin. They believed the things that the Bible taught. The Bible also teaches that these people were very religious people because they were there in Jerusalem. They were in Jerusalem for the Passover feast. They were there to offer the sacrifice. And any good Jew that was a religious Jew would come and offer up the sacrifices. But the Bible says this about these people, is that they were rejected by Jesus. And the reason why is because he knew what was in their heart and didn't need for anybody else to give a testimony or to give a word about them. But Jesus rejected them. Which tells me this, that a person can be religious, that a person can believe in Jesus, but yet a person can still miss God's salvation that he offers through a relationship with Christ. As I read those verses, I'm often reminded of my story and how God has worked in my life. I was born in South Carolina. Most of you know that. Born in South Carolina, and grew up there going to a little Baptist church. I lived next door to the preacher. I lived next door to the parsonage. And one of the highlights of my career was one Sunday morning when we should have been in church, I shot the preacher's car window out with a BB gun. Don't tell anybody that, okay? That's just for us to know. But we lived next door to the preacher, and our little church there got a new preacher every 2 years, whether they needed one or not. Y'all know how that goes. And they decided they needed a new preacher, and so they got one. And my parents liked the preacher. And so as long as they liked the preacher, they kept going to church. And they would go to church. And this preacher, he was a nice guy. And we went to church with this preacher. And that was the time I was about 10 years old. When I was about 12 years old, I decided it was time for me to do the Baptist thing, and I joined the church and got baptized. And I remember going forward and telling the preacher, I want to join the church and I want to get baptized. And so he signed me up. We weren't even fancy enough to have cards or anything like that to fill out. He just signed me up, and I got baptized. I remember getting baptized. It was February 4th. I believe it was 1980. And our church was real excited because we had just, I'm telling you where I grew up, we had just gotten a water heater. And so they said now when I say water heater, I'm talking about the inline kind, that's in your house, 30-gallon water heater. I'm not talking about a water heater that sticks over into baptistry. And we were excited because for the first time ever, we were going to have a baptism with warm water. It was February 4th. I want you to know, unless they've changed something to this day, they've still not had a baptism with warm water. I went in that day, and I remember I went in a dry center and came out a wet, cold center, because you see, all I'd done was join the church and gotten baptized. A couple of years later, we got a new preacher. And when this new preacher came in town, he came in on his very first Sunday. I remember him preaching. And I remember for the first time in my life, I heard the gospel. Now, that's not to say that I'd never heard it with my ears before, but the Bible talks about hearing with your ears and not hearing with your heart. And that day, I heard with my heart. And I was sitting over on this side there in our church, and he preached, and he shared the plan of salvation, and he prayed the sinner's prayer. And he said this, if you prayed that prayer, would you raise your hand? So I did the Billy Graham thing, and I raised my hand. And he said, come forward, and I sat in my seat. And I never moved. But for years, people would ask me, when did you get saved? And I said, when I got saved, sitting on a pew, the second pew in Furman Baptist Church in Furman, South Carolina, when I prayed the sinner's prayer and asked Jesus to come into my heart. I went on, and through my teenage years, there were some things that took place in my life. My parents separated when I was 15 years old, began the process of getting a divorce. When I was 16 years old, my dad committed suicide. So through all of that time, I was a very confused young man. But during that time, my mom remained in church, and we actually changed churches, started going to a different church down the road. And during that time, that same pastor was there. He actually stayed for 5.5 years there at our little church. And he had more than one church, and he was pastor of another church down the road, so we went to his other church, and through all of that, I remained in church and read the Bible and tried to do things that were right. I'm not saying I did everything that was right, but I tried to do things that were right. And when I was 16 years old, I sensed that God was, after my dad had died, I sensed that God was calling me to the ministry. So I didn't have a problem with being obedient to God at that time. So when the invitation time was given on that Sunday, I came forward and I told the pastor, I said, God's called me to preach. And he said something that rocked my world. He looked at me and he said, so that means you're going to go to college and go to seminary, get an education, and prepare for the ministry. Now, I say that rocked my world because up to that point, I never had planned on going to college in that level. I grew up in a farming community, and so my plan was this. When I got out of college, I got out of high school, I was going to join the Army. I was going to learn how to fly a helicopter. This was a goal in my life, and this is what I wanted to do. I was going to learn how to fly a helicopter in the Army. Whenever I got out, I was going to go to college on the GI Bill, and I was going to go to Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College in Tifton, Georgia. That was my goal in life. And I was going to go down, and I was going to learn chemicals, and I was going to get out, and I was going to open me a crop dusting service flying a helicopter. Pretty good goal, wasn't it? But God changed my life. And that pastor said that day, you're going to go to college and go to seminary and get an education and prepare for the ministry. And my life was changed. I began at that point, though, to run from God a little bit because, you see, quite frankly, I didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to go to that much college. Little did I know it was going to turn into the number of years that it turned into, with getting married and having children and having to wait out a semester and all those things and all that took place there during those times in my life. But I began to run from God a little bit about this idea about going to college and preparing for the ministry. But I made it through high school. And at that point, I said, well, here it is now, do or die, I'm going to school. So I enrolled in Anderson College, which was, at that time, a 2-year Baptist school in Anderson, South Carolina. I enrolled and I went, and I made up my mind at that point I was going to get serious about God. So I went and I joined the BSU, and I started having a quiet time, and I got involved in a church there in Anderson, and I got involved in Christianity and Christian activities and started doing a lot of stuff Christianity-wise, and got to be known, got to preach in a lot of different places, and got to see some things happen in my life. At the end of my freshman year, I went and served as a missionary with what was then the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. For 10 weeks during the summer, I served in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is a county just outside of Washington, D.C. And I went and I served there for that summer and was from church to church doing Vacation Bible School almost every week. I'm going to tell you what, we did Vacation Bible School so much that summer, I mean, I knew it all about Vacation Bible School. And when the summer was over with, that summer, I'd gotten up every day and read my Bible and tried to pray and done things that were right and preached and all the things that I tried to do in serving the Lord. But at the end of the summer, I came back to school. And when I